The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had their fill, he said to the disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is coming into this world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him a king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The Gospel of the Lord.
If I were to ask you, do you truly believe that God is going to take care of you, that all your needs will be met, and that he will take care of you forever in the eternal happiness of heaven? Do you really believe that? I think a lot of people would say, "Well, I hope that's true, Father. I'm trying to believe it, but some days I do better than others. When something bad happens, it makes me wonder, God, are you taking care of me? Could you take better care of me?" And I know those days when I'm not conscious of it, people say to me, I get anxious and fearful, and I worry a lot. One of the graces that I continually hear from the Lord is that, sure, I believe, I trust in God's care for me, but to really believe in God's providence. I have a retreat director that would always say, this great line, he would always say, God's love and care for you infinitely exceeds your knowledge of his love and care for you. I'll say that again. God's love and care for you infinitely exceeds your knowledge of his love and care for you. There's 2 things about God that the Catholic Church continuously stresses and the Gospels talk about all the time. One is God's infinite power. We call that omnipotence. God is, we believe in God the Father Almighty, that he can do anything that he chooses. And secondly, we stress his infinite love and care for each one of us. So he's infinite in power, and he loves you infinitely. What does that translate into? You're going to be taken care of, right? But what happens? Bad things happen. Things that you pray for don't happen, or hardships come. And then what do? God, where are you? I thought you were going to take care of me. our Catholic teaching, you are more valuable than all the animals and all the plants in the world put together. Did you know that? All the animals and all the plants in the entire world and all the mountains, every one of you in this church is more valuable than all the animals and plants in the world put together. Why? Because you are made in the image and likeness of God for your own sake, with freedom and self-determination, destined for eternal glory with God. Animals and plants are not. They are here for our benefit. We're supposed to be good stewards, take good care of them, absolutely. Jesus knows how many hairs are on your head. That's how much He loves you. And believe me, He has the power to take care of you. Only God can create. You know, the Hebrew word bara can only have God, that means to create, can only have God as its subject. God creates. But we use that word often. We say, come and look at my creation. Maybe I've painted a picture or something like that. But actually, that's not creation in itself. Creation means to create ex nihilo, from nothing, bring something. Are you with me? To start with nothing. Now, we know physics, right? Matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but simply changed back and forth from one form to the other. Only God creates ex nihilo. From nothing, He brings something. So I always used to tell my students the little joke or story that God and the devil were talking one day, and the devil said, let's have a contest to see who can create the most beautiful thing. And so God said, okay, you go first. And so the devil grabbed some dirt, and God said, get your own dirt. Are you with me? Illustrating only God can create. Bara. Take from nothing, He brings something. And if a person never sits in the classroom of silence and reflects on those two things, the infinite power of God and His infinite love for you, that person worries a lot. They can be filled with a lot of anxiety, worried about who's going to take care of me. There's a Spanish proverb that goes like this: prosperity is the most dangerous situation of man. What does it mean? It means that, like in our country, we're very prosperous and we're very blessed to live in the United States where there's lots of food. And, never has there been a time in my life where I said, oh my gosh, where is supper going to come from? We have no money, there's no food. That's never happened to me in my entire life. I lived raised on a farm. We always had plenty of food and opportunities and things like that. And prosperity can be dangerous because when we really need God to supply our essential needs, our faith really grows. But when we don't really need Him for our essentials, are you with me? Sometimes our faith is not tested. Many people never really believe and plead for God until they need God. And that's very important. That surrender to God happens when we really need Him. We can't change what's happening. When we lose control, then we say, Jesus, help me. I can't do this. But bad things have to happen often before people really surrender. There's a great quote, and I'll say this one as well. I read once that for every 100 persons who can overcome adversity, there's only one who can overcome prosperity. I'm going to say that again. For every 100 persons who can overcome adversity, there's only one who can overcome prosperity. What does that mean? It means that when a person, a man or a woman, has everything they need, and they still surrender themselves to Christ and realize they're nothing without Him and plead for Him every second, it's harder to have faith in a place of prosperity. Isn't that ironic? And yet it's true. Our faith grows when we struggle, and we have to turn to God for help. In John chapter 6, we're reading today the Gospel of John. Very interesting. Jesus is preaching and healing. He's exhausted. His disciples exhausted. They need a rest. So they get into their boats and they go a 4-mile journey across the Sea of Galilee to a special place of shade and rest near a town called Bethsaida. Now, one of his disciples named Philip was from Bethsaida. That's where he came from. He knew the area. He said, let's go to Bethsaida. We can rest there. But guess what the people do? They need Jesus so much, and they know they need him. They walk 9 miles around the lake to Bethsaida. They saw the direction of his boat. They walked 9 miles around the lake. And guess, when Jesus disembarks, guess who's there? All these people. And the Lord begins to teach them. Now, the gospel also says something important that it's easy to miss. The gospel says it was the time of Passover, which means the region would have had hundreds of thousands. That's not an exaggeration. Hundreds of thousands of people on the road heading toward Jerusalem. How do we know that? During Passover, the city of Jerusalem, normally the city of Jerusalem had about 200,000 inhabitants during the time of Christ. During Passover, 1 million people came into the walled city of Jerusalem. They literally would have been like sardines trying to walk through the streets. Every Jew who lived within 20 miles of Jerusalem was required by Jewish law to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Passover every single year. But every Jew in the world dreamed of at least once in their lifetime being able to go to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. So what's the message here? Huge crowds, people everywhere coming and going. And most of these people, unless they were locals, would have been traveling with some supplies. Jew on a journey in the time of Christ would always have a bottle-shaped basket over their shoulder, usually some bread, some dried fruit, maybe a few pickled fish, no bigger than sardines, and a canister of water. And they would have had a sleeping garment, a cloak, because they had to sleep on the ground. And it would be madness to travel in 90-degree heat by day and desert cold by night without some provisions, because it was difficult to find and buy necessities. There was no super Kroger. So keep in mind, as we look at this miracle, some of the people in that massive crowd would have had food in their basket. They were traveling to Passover. Now, Jesus knew full well what he was going to do, but he was training and testing his disciples. So he says to Philip, you're the local man who knows the area of Bethsaida. He said, where can we buy enough food for all of these people to eat? And Philip bites the bait. Lord, it's impossible. Look at all these people. It would take 6 months of work and the pay of 6 months to even give this many people a mouthful. It's hopeless. We all know people like that, don't we? Who immediately catastrophize and talk about how terrible everything is. But without being asked, another disciple comes up. What was his name? Andrew. And what does Andrew say? Even without being asked, Lord, there's a lad here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But he adds honestly, looking at Jesus, but what good is that for so many? Inviting the Lord to show us. And Jesus prays and gives thanks again, teaching us what we should do. And then he shares, once again, teaching us what we should do. And everybody eats plenty. Jewish law also dictated that whenever Jewish people had a feast or a banquet, they were not to eat every bit of food on the table. They were to intentionally leave things on the table for the poor. Even at harvest, when they went through their fields, they were not to get every little bit of fruit off the branches or off the stalks of wheat, leaving some for the poor. And here the apostles go and pick up leftover bread and fish, 12 baskets full. How many disciples did he have? 12, who filled their baskets for the next 7 days. There's a theory, I don't like it very much, but I'll tell you what it is. Some biblical scholars say that, or suggest, that Jesus did not really multiply bread and fish this day, but that basically lots of people had some bread and fish in their baskets, and what the Lord did was, by sharing the little he had, he encouraged them to be generous, and everyone opened their baskets. And they say that this is what he did not change the bread and fish, but he changed the men and women. I think Jesus did both. I don't believe that theory. It was a miracle either way, but if it happened that way, St. John would have said that's what happened. Their hearts would have changed. Jesus did a miracle. He multiplied that bread and those fish, and he fed 5,000 people. 5,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fish. What did I say were the 2 things the church always reminds God's people about? He is omnipotent. He can do anything. And what's the second thing? He loves you infinitely. He knows how many hairs on your head. What's the message here? He is going to take care of your needs. I didn't say He won't let you get hungry sometimes and wait till the last minute. Are you with me? But He loves you. He's going to, and the other reason, of course, if you read John chapter 6, you know that's the gospel all about the Eucharist, isn't it? And John chapter 6, the multiplication of bread and wine, Jesus is saying, I have power over bread, just as He has power over the bread and wine, which He changes into His body and blood. God is going to take care of us, but sometimes He lets us wait till the last minute, doesn't He? He lets us struggle because that stretches our hearts. The Lord doesn't need us. That's what omnipotence means. He doesn't need anything. And yet, God prefers to include us to demonstrate our dignity, to work with Him in the great miracles. Matthew Kelly writes something very interesting. He says, I wonder how many miracles have not been done by God because God invited another person to do something or give something, and that person said no, or they did not respond. And the miracle was left undone. The crowd was left hungry. It's an interesting thing to think about. One of the fascinating things that I think we will discover in our particular judgment when we meet Jesus face to face is what God did with our generosity. We can't even see all the good He does. We'll be in heaven, God will still be doing good. That's called, St. Thomas says, love is diffusive of itself. What does that mean? It means that long after you're dead, God will continue to use your goodness to bring goodness to others. And I think we will see what God did with our generosity, and we will also see the things that God did not do when we were not generous. And I think that individual judgment is a time of joy and a time of sadness because we will see those things so clearly. And that's why as Catholics, we confess not only sins of commission, but sins of omission, don't we? It's not just what we do or say, it's what we don't do when God invites us to be generous and to take care of others. When I give retreats, you meet people that are just like both of these apostles, Philip and who was the other one? Andrew, thank you. And Philip, is always the first one to say, it's hopeless, people are leaving the church, people aren't following Christ anymore, throw in the towel. You always meet people like that sometimes. And then you meet people like Andrew who says, well, I have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, not very much for so many people, but I will give it. And then we watch God do a great miracle. So, this is what the Lord invites us to do today. What are the 2 things the church reminds us of today? God is omnipotent. What does that mean? Infinite in power. He can do all things. Whatever your needs are, He can supply them. And number 2, He loves you infinitely and unconditionally. He thinks about your happiness all the time, and He has the power to bring you that great fulfillment. Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever. Amen.